The man took orders, but never left a trace behind. Welcome to the Wimsey Casebook. I am your host, Morgan Finch. Join the mystery, comment below with your location, and become part of the case. Now, the story unfolds. The morning had not yet turned grey, but the light through the window was already dulled. A pale, reluctant sort of light that came with the damp breath of November. Chiefly. Inspector Maigret sat at the kitchen table of his modest apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, his thick fingers wrapped around a plain ceramic cup. The coffee was tepid. His pipe, unlit, rested beside a folded newspaper he hadn't yet opened. Madame Maigret moved about quietly, her slippers brushing the linoleum as she tidied dishes from breakfast. There had been no conversation, not out of tension but habit. The inspector's mind was elsewhere, gently circling some thought that hadn't yet formed into a shape. She glanced at him, then at the coffee cup he hadn't refilled. "You're not going in early?" she asked without pressing. Maigret shook his head. "I told Janvier I'd come by afternoon. Let the boys sort out the business on Rue de la Grange aux Belles." She didn't ask what business. She seldom did anymore. When she spoke again, it was to suggest they walk to the shops later if the weather didn't worsen. Maigret nodded absently, only half hearing. A cold draught crept in from the windowsill. The seal was never quite right in winter. The radiator ticked faintly behind him. It wasn't a case that troubled him. There was no case, not officially. But something had begun to scratch gently at his thoughts. It had started 2 nights earlier, after a small supper with an old friend from Liège, a retired judge now teaching at the university. They had eaten simply: roast chicken, endive salad, a bottle of red that Maigret had picked because it reminded him of dinners from years ago, ones where they still smoked at the table and argued over Baudelaire. The judge had chosen the restaurant, a narrow place in the 12th, unpretentious, with cream-colored walls and a single row of tables, beneath lamps shaded in dull brass. It had been the waiter, not the food, not the conversation, not even the way the judge had rambled about court reform. Just the waiter, middle-aged slim, wearing the standard black vest and long white apron. Nothing remarkable in appearance except, and Maigret hadn't noticed, until dessert. The man hadn't spoken a word all evening. Not when he poured wine, not when he cleared plates, not when Maigret asked politely for a second fork after his had slipped to the floor. He had only nodded. Once. Expressionless. Efficient. At the time, Maigret hadn't remarked on it. But walking home along the wet pavement of Rue Claude Dequin, something about it stayed with him. There was something odd, even oppressive, in the man's silence, and not just silence. Absence. He had asked the maître d'hôtel in passing what the waiter's name was. The man had frowned, then replied, "Oh, him. I think he's new, came in last week, quiet type, no trouble." No first name was offered, not even a shrug. That was all. But Maigret, now sipping the lukewarm coffee in his kitchen, found himself still thinking about it. He had gone back yesterday, alone this time, saying he had forgotten his umbrella. It was a weak pretext, but sufficient. The waiter was there again. Same manner, same presence that was barely a presence. He had looked at Maigret, or rather, had not looked at him. His face had passed over Maigret's with the impassivity of a coat rack or a window. Shutter. It wasn't rudeness, it wasn't fear. It was emptiness. Maigret had encountered killers who trembled when they saw him, petty thieves who puffed up with bravado, and victims who clung to his coat as if he were a priest. But this man, this waiter, looked at him as if he simply didn't exist. Now he tapped his pipe once against the saucer and got to his feet. "I'll take a walk," he told his wife. "In this weather?" she asked gently, glancing toward the window where the sky had turned the color of dishwater. He smiled faintly. I want to see if that waiter's still there." "At the restaurant?" He nodded. "Why?" Maigret paused in the doorway. I don't know. That's what I want to find out." The rain began just as he reached the Quai de la Râpée. It wasn't a storm, just a light, needling drizzle that softened outlines and smeared the glow of traffic lights. Maigret walked without hurry, the collar of his heavy coat turned up, his hat pulled low. He passed a newsstand, glanced at the headlines without stopping. A bank robbery in Roubaix, a scandal involving a deputy minister. The world carried on, its usual confusion. By the time he reached the little restaurant on Rue de Prague, the midday service was just beginning. Through the fogged glass he could see a few couples sitting stiffly at the small tables. There was no music, only the faint clink of plates and cutlery. And the waiter was there again. Same black vest, same blank composure. Maigret didn't enter. He remained across the street beside a lamp-post watching. He lit his pipe with a match that took 2 strikes to catch, and the flare of light revealed a quiet seriousness in his features. Not suspicion, exactly, not yet. But something had rooted itself, a sense, intangible and stubborn, that the man in there wasn't just a waiter. He stood in the rain for a long time. Just watching. The man never looked toward the window. The rain had grown steadier, fine needles soaking the brim of Maigret's hat as he stood across from the restaurant. He shifted slightly on the balls of his feet, not out of impatience but to keep warm. He had not moved in nearly 15 minutes. The traffic behind him passed in slow murmurs, a delivery van growling as it turned the corner, tires hissing in the slick street. He lit another match, drew twice from his pipe, then let it go out again. It didn't matter. He was not there to smoke. The waiter moved between tables inside, as impassive as before. He walked with a kind of practiced economy, neither graceful nor clumsy, just invisible. His hands did not shake. He made no unnecessary gestures. There was no conversation, not even the polite murmurs that waiters usually exchange with regulars or flustered tourists. And no one, not a single customer, appeared to notice anything strange. That, Maigret thought, might be the strangest thing of all. Eventually he stepped away from the curb and crossed the street. The bell above the door gave a soft jingle as he entered, releasing a faint gust of heat tinged with wine and shallots. Inside it was warmer, quiet, with a hush, like the back row of a matinee. A waiter turned. Not that one. Another. Younger. Man with a high forehead and damp hair, and offered a neutral greeting. Maigret removed his coat and hung it carefully on the brass stand near the door. "Good afternoon," he said quietly. "Table for 1, monsieur?" "Yes." "By the radiator, if it's free." The waiter gave a brief nod and led him past 2 occupied tables. One held a woman in a green wool coat, dabbing at her lips between bites of veal. The other, a middle-aged man, reading a racing form while picking absently at a lentil salad. Maigret took the seat beside the old radiator, which clicked faintly as if adjusting its bones. From here, he had a clear view of the room and, more importantly, of the man who had been on his mind for days. The silent waiter. He was across the dining room now, adjusting the alignment of silverware at an empty setting. His head was slightly bowed, the profile sharp beneath the restaurant's dim sconces. He wore no name tag, not unusual perhaps, but something in his demeanor made the omission feel deliberate. Maigret accepted the menu without looking at it. His eyes stayed on the waiter. The young server who had seated him lingered for a moment before clearing his throat. "Would you like something to drink, monsieur?" "A carafe of red." "The house." He said it almost automatically, then reached into his coat for his notebook. He didn't open it. He only laid it beside his plate as though anchoring himself to a different world, the one where a policeman asked questions, made reports, weighed testimony. But here, he wasn't investigating, not officially. There had been no complaint, no theft, no violence, only a man with no expression, no conversation, and, as far as Maigret could tell, no history. The wine arrived, and Maigret poured it himself. He sipped. It was unremarkable. The silent waiter passed behind him once, not too close, not too far. Maigret felt his presence the way one senses a coat hung on a wall, a shape, not a person. He ordered the cassoulet, simple fare, and an excuse to linger. When the food came, delivered by the younger waiter, Maigret finally asked casually, "Is the other gentleman new here?" The young man blinked. "Which one?" "The one in the black vest, thinner, doesn't speak." "Oh, yes, I think he started last week, or the week before, came in through the agency." "Agency?" "Yes, a temp placement service. They send someone when there's a gap in the rota, mostly kitchens, sometimes servers." "Did he give a name?" The waiter hesitated. I think it was Raymond, but I'm not sure if that's first or last." Maigret smiled faintly. "No one calls him by name?" The young man shrugged, apologetic. "He keeps to himself." Maigret nodded and waved the boy off gently. He ate a few bites of the cassoulet, chewing slowly, watching the waiter, Raymond perhaps, as he cleared a corner table with the same mechanical grace. No one spoke to him. None of the customers acknowledged him, not in gratitude, not in irritation. He moved through the space like fog. When Maigret was halfway through his dish, the maître d'hôtel appeared. An older man with clipped hair and the faint flush of a habitual drinker. He greeted Maigret with polite confusion. "Is everything all right, monsieur?" "Fine," Maigret said, motioning toward the cassoulet. "You've kept the recipe the same all these years?" The maître d'hôtel offered a guarded smile. "You've been here before?" Maigret nodded. "Years ago. With my wife. Before the war." "Ah, I'm surprised you don't recognize me." The maître d'hôtel squinted. "Should I?" Maigret let it sit a moment, then leaned slightly closer. "Chief Inspector Maigret from the Quai des Orfèvres." The maître d'hôtel went pale for a moment, then smoothed his lapel. "Of course. Forgive me. I didn't... No offense." "Taken. I'm not here on business, just curiosity." He let the sentence hang there. The maître d'hôtel shifted. "May I ask, curiosity about what?" "About your new waiter, the one who doesn't speak." The older man cleared his throat. "He's been adequate. But you don't know his name." "Well, the agency gave us a form, but I don't use it." "No." "Do you find that strange?" The maître d'hôtel looked genuinely perplexed. "He shows up on time. He works clean. Doesn't steal. What else do we need?" Maigret made a small sound in his throat. Not disagreement, just acknowledgement. The maître d'hôtel excused himself, and Maigret returned to his wine. The rain outside had grown fainter, softer. It no longer beat the window panes, but collected on the glass like breath. He finished his meal, paid in cash, and left a modest tip. As he passed the silent waiter, he turned slightly and met the man's gaze. For the first time their eyes locked. The waiter did not blink. His face was unreadable, not cold, but void. And Maigret knew in that moment that this was not about a stolen name or a missing form. It was about something deeper, a life disassembled and repackaged into silence. He stepped back out into the drizzle and walked without direction. Not toward the police station, not toward home, but toward whatever it was that hid behind the absence of that man's name. The rain had slackened to a whisper by the time Maigret found himself walking along the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis. It wasn't where he had intended to go. His feet, as they sometimes did, had taken over, leading him down familiar streets, past dim-lit cafés with steamed-up windows, shuttered epiceries, and tobacconists just beginning to close their rolling grills for the evening. This part of Paris, full of boarding houses, small hotels, and working people, held memories for Maigret. It was here long ago that he had followed a man for 5 nights, only to discover the crime had been committed not by the man, but by his daughter. Nothing extraordinary, just one of those quiet human tragedies like a thread snipped with small scissors. It had ended without headlines. As he walked, his thoughts circled the silent waiter, not on what the man had done, if anything, but on what he was. People leave traces, Maigret believed, even when they try not to, especially then. He stopped at a zinc-topped bar on the corner of Rue de Paradis and stepped inside. It was nearly empty, just a few men hunched over glasses of pastis. The owner, a woman in her 60s with dyed auburn hair and an apron smudged with ash, gave him a glance, then a nod of recognition. "Monsieur Maigret," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "You haven't been in since the gas strike." "Too long," he agreed, removing his coat and easing himself onto a bar stool. "The usual?" "Please." She poured him a glass of white wine, cheap but drinkable, and set it down with a practiced motion. "Looking for someone?" she asked casually. "You've got that face," he smiled. "What kind of face is that?" "The kind that pretends to be thinking about the weather." He let out a small chuckle. "Do you know any temporary work agencies in this neighborhood? Ones that place kitchen help?" The woman leaned against the bar, eyes narrowing slightly. "You mean the kind that sends men out for a week and never asks too many questions?" "Yes. There's one on Rue du Faubourg, next to that old dry cleaners that shut down last winter. They use the upstairs of a travel agency. The sign just says placement and travail. Half the letters are peeling." He nodded, finishing his wine. "Merci." She looked at him a beat longer. "He done something? This one you're looking for?" "I don't know yet. Maybe he's just forgotten who he is." She didn't press further. She knew better than to ask. Maigret left a few coins on the counter, buttoned his coat, and stepped back into the street. The placement agency wasn't hard to find. Fire-peeling doorframe, a set of stairs that smelled faintly of mildew and soup stock. Upstairs, a row of cracked glass panes revealed a cramped office with linoleum floors and a flickering tube light. Inside sat a clerk, thin to the point of transparency, his elbows resting in a stack of manila folders. "Yes?" he asked without looking up. Maigret approached the counter slowly. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I'm not even sure I have a question yet." The clerk raised his head. "I see. I was at a restaurant on Rue de Prague this afternoon. One of your placements was working there. Older man, thin, quiet. That doesn't narrow it down." "I suppose not. They called him Raymond. I'd like to know if you have anything on him." The clerk hesitated, then pushed back from the desk with a sigh and moved to a filing cabinet. He ran a finger along the tabs. "You a cop?" Maigret took out his wallet and showed his identification without flourish. "Doesn't mean I'm investigating anything," he added. "Only watching." The clerk pulled a file from the drawer. "Raymond, only one, registered 10 days ago, no surname, just Raymond. Signed the form in block letters, didn't give a permanent address, contact numbers fake. We tried." "Shoot. But he shows up on time, clean, quiet, clients don't complain." He handed Maigret the sheet. It was sparse. Age listed as 48. Place of birth, blank. No emergency contact. Under previous work experience, the man had written. Simply restaurants. Cafés, hotels. Maigret studied the handwriting. It was precise but overly careful, like someone trying to imitate clarity. A man trying to be legible, not known. "Did he say anything unusual when he applied?" Maigret asked. "No. Just Wanted a job, said he didn't need much, was willing to take evening shifts. Did he look tired? The clerk blinked. Tired? Yes. A pause. No. Just used up. Not sick, not weak. Just like he'd had enough of things. Maigret handed the paper back. Thank you, he said, then added, if he comes in again, don't tell him anyone was asking. Let it be. The clerk nodded once. Sure. Back on the street, the light had faded entirely, and the buildings glowed from within, blurred by the drizzle that still clung to the air like breath on glass. Maigret walked slowly. The silence of the man, this Raymond or whoever he was, had become louder the more he traced its outline. No address, no phone, no past. He thought of a story once told to him by a young sergeant, a man who faked amnesia after a robbery, hoping to avoid prison by pretending he couldn't remember the crime. But in the end, it wasn't the police who caught him. It was his own memory that betrayed him, one night in a bar, when he sang a song he'd promised he didn't know. People always gave themselves away. Back at home, Madame Maigret had left a note on the table. Kept your supper warm, it's in the oven. I went to bed early. Reading that mystery novel you said was terrible. He smiled faintly and poured himself a glass of water. The apartment was quiet. He didn't turn on the radio. Instead, he sat down and opened a small notepad. He wrote one word at the top of the page, Raymond, then below it. No surname, no address, fake contact number, no conversation, no presence. And finally, he wrote, why now? That was the question that mattered. Why had this man, who wanted no name and no past, chosen to appear now, at that restaurant? Why take a job? Why risk being seen? He sat in silence, the ticking of the wall clock slow and deliberate. Outside, the rain began again. It was still dark when Maigret awoke the next morning, though the faint outline of the window curtain hinted, at dawn somewhere beyond the heavy clouds. A slow patter of rain tapped softly against the glass, and from the kitchen came the quiet rattle of china. Madame Maigret was already up, as she often was, placing bread on the table and humming without realizing it, a habit from her girlhood in Meung-sur-Loire. Maigret sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face. He hadn't slept poorly, but not deeply either. His dreams, if they came at all, had been full of half-faces and mismatched voices, none he could name. He dressed slowly, listening to the familiar domestic sounds. A drawer opening, the click of the gas stove, the dull thump of a teapot being set down. In the kitchen, the coffee had just finished percolating. He poured himself a cup, nodded his thanks to his wife, and sat at the table. She looked at him with mild curiosity as she buttered a slice of bread. You were out late, she said softly. Without accusation, I walked. In the rain. He gave a small smile. I've walked in worse. She studied him for a moment. Is it a case? Not yet. Then it's someone, he nodded. A man who doesn't speak, a waiter. And he did something. Not exactly, but he's missing. Not officially, but in the way a man can be standing right in front of you and still be missing. She spread the butter with slow, even strokes, then set the knife down gently. I suppose some people like it that way, she said. To be unseen. Maigret looked at her, then out the window. Across the street, an old woman was shaking crumbs from her window-sill to the pigeons below. That was Madame Pardon, the retired music teacher who sometimes brought pickled beets to neighborhood gatherings and always wore wool gloves, even in June. She had lived there longer than anyone else. In the building. She once claimed to have seen Maigret chase a burglar down the alley behind the grocer's, but he didn't remember the incident. Perhaps it had been someone else. I think I'll visit the neighborhood again, he said finally, rising. His wife handed him a small brown paper parcel. Your scarf, she said. It's colder than it looks. Maigret kissed her cheek and made his way downstairs. Outside, the air had that particular chill that clung to collarbones and made smokers linger less than usual. The rain was light, intermittent. He walked with his hands in his pockets, not briskly, but with the slow rhythm of someone sifting through thoughts. It was too early for the restaurant to be open, so he returned to the agency first. The same clerk was there, this time eating a soft-boiled egg at his desk, balancing the shell on a saucer and looking vaguely embarrassed to be seen doing something so personal in a public space. "Morning," Maigret said quietly. The man set down his spoon. "Back already?" Maigret nodded. "Do you ever keep track of where your workers come from before they arrive here?" "We ask," the clerk replied. "But if they don't answer, there's not much we can do. We're not the police." "No, you're not." He paused. "Did this Raymond show any accent? Regional phrasing? A limp? Anything?" The clerk thought for a moment, chewing his lip. "He didn't say much, but now that you mention it, he pronounced pain with a hard nasal, like they do in Limoges. Could mean nothing. It could mean a great deal." Maigret made a small note in his pad. He spent the rest of the morning walking the back streets behind the Rue de Prague, drifting past laundries, florist shops and newsagents. It wasn't official canvassing. He didn't flash a badge or bark. Questions. He simply observed. Watched the men smoking outside kitchen doors. Listened to snippets of conversations between grocers and delivery boys. Then, as he turned the corner past a shuttered cinema, he caught sight of a face he recognized, not from any file or casebook, but from long ago. It was Madame Fardel, who had once worked as a scullery maid in a hotel on the left bank, where Maigret had broken up a smuggling ring. Now she was behind the glass counter of a small bakery, her grey hair tied back and her hands white with flour. He stepped inside, letting the bell over the door ring gently. Madame Fardel. She looked up, startled, then smiled. "Maigret." "My goodness. You remember me. Of course, you took the cuffs off my brother when he cried in front of the concierge. He never forgot that." "I'm not here for family business," he said. "Just curiosity." She motioned for him to step behind the counter, which he did with a slight bow. "I'm looking into someone, not officially. A waiter, quiet, pale, about 50. Works at Le Petit Dauphin on Rue de Prague. They say his name's Raymond, but no one's sure." Her brow furrowed. "A week ago," she said slowly, "a man matching that description came in here just before closing. Didn't buy anything. Just stood near the back wall and watched. I thought he was casing the till, but he looked sad, not dangerous. Did he speak? No? Did he leave anything behind?" She shook her head, then paused. "Actually, yes. A small ticket, like a dry cleaning stub. It was under the chair. I don't know if it was his." She opened a drawer and produced it, a faded slip of blue paper with a stamped number and a handwritten scrawl. "R.G. Chemise Blanche." Maigret took it delicately. "Do you remember where your customers take their laundry?" "There's only one place left nearby. Madame Guibert on Rue Cloche-Perce. She's been there for 30 years. Maigret thanked her and left, holding the paper between two fingers like a thread he couldn't afford to lose. At the laundry, the bell rang with a wooden clack, and an older woman emerged from the back room, her hands red from starch water. "Yes?" Maigret showed her the slip. "Do you recognize this?" She squinted. "One of mine. I use those stubs. R.G., she thought. That would be the tall one. Quiet. Looks like a violinist who stopped playing. Left a white shirt last week. Picked it up 3 days ago. Did he pay cash?" "Yes, small bills. Did he say anything?" She hesitated. "When I gave him the shirt, I said, 'Hope to see you again.' He said, 'You won't.' And you haven't, no." Maigret looked down at the stub. A shirt, a name reduced to 2 initials, and a promise not to return. Outside, the sky had gone slate grey again. He folded the stub and tucked it in his wallet. Raymond, if that was his name, had left a trail. Not a loud one, not full of alibis or fingerprints, but a human trail. The kind that belonged to someone trying to fade into the spaces between things. Back at home, Maigret wrote one more line in his notebook. R.G., not a name, a retreat. And he sat there, long after the ink dried, as the pigeons landed again on Madame. Pardon's windowsill, waiting for the next crumb of truth to fall. By late afternoon the city had sunk into the heavy quiet that comes before a deeper cold. The rain had stopped, but the streets remained wet and slick, and the wind had taken on a dry edge as if the season was shifting one bone closer to winter. Maigret stood in front of a 5-story residential building on Rue de Citeaux. It was one of those apartment blocks that seemed to blend into itself. Grey facade, iron balconies with plants left to wither, a front door that needed a firm hand to close properly. Nothing about it suggested a story, yet that was precisely why he had come. The name R.G. had returned to him in a flash after a second coffee and another glance at the laundry stub. Not the initials, but the memory of them. Written, years ago, in the margins of an old police report involving a minor dispute between tenants. A man living under borrowed letters. It was Janvier who had noted it then, and though the report hadn't amounted to much, just noise complaints and a suspicion of false identity, Maigret had remembered the building. He pressed the buzzer. Beside the name Giraud 5e étage. There was no reply. He waited, then pressed again. The main door opened from inside without sound. A boy in a green scarf, no more than 10, slipped past him and down the steps, not looking up. Maigret entered. The stairwell smelled of cabbage and linseed oil. The kind of place where the windows hadn't been opened in weeks. He climbed steadily, not quickly. Stairs were no longer his ally, until he reached the 5th floor. The hallway here was narrow and quiet. The carpet underfoot was worn TUI. The thread. At the far end, a single door stood with a tarnished brass number 23 and no visible nameplate. He knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again, then tried the handle. It turned, but the door resisted, locked from inside. He stood still for a long moment, breathing in the silence. Then he turned around. There was another door nearby, left slightly ajar. He knocked gently, and it swung open further to reveal a woman in a brown cardigan seated by the window, knitting something indeterminate in shape and color. She looked up, not surprised to see him. "You're not the postman," she said. "No," Maigret replied, with a faint smile. "I'm looking for the man in number 23, Monsieur Giraud." "He doesn't get visitors," she said, not unkindly, "and I don't think that's his name." "No?" She set down her knitting and looked at him more closely. "Are you a policeman?" He nodded. "Then maybe it's good you've come." He stepped inside the threshold but did not sit. Has he been living there long? A few months, came in September, paid in cash. Quiet. Too quiet. Doesn't talk to anyone. Doesn't go out much either. I used to hear him pacing, but even... That's stopped lately. Does he get mail? Never. Visitors? She shook her head. No. Just once someone came, but they didn't stay long. A woman. Early October. I only saw her back as she left. Her shoulders were hunched. Like she was crying. Maigret let the silence stretch for a moment. Did he give a name to the landlord? He told Madame Lepic his name was René Giraud, but she didn't ask for papers, just took the rent. She's not one to bother with details. Maigret thanked. Her offered a polite bow and stepped back into the hallway. He stood again before the door to number 23. This time he knocked harder. After a long pause there was movement, a faint shuffling from behind the door like the turning of a chair leg against the floor. Then silence. "Raymond?" Maigret said, voice calm, barely louder than the wind outside the hallway window. No answer. I'm not here to arrest you. Another pause. I don't even know what you've done. If anything. More silence. But the shuffling had stopped. I only want to talk. The lock clicked once, then again. Slowly. The door opened an inch. Raymond, or René, stood there, framed by the dim light of a sparsely furnished room. He looked thinner than before, his skin grey around the cheeks, his collarbone pressed visibly against the fabric of his shirt. He didn't speak. "May I come in?" Maigret asked gently. The man stepped back and opened the door just enough to let him pass. The room smelled faintly of dust and boiled potatoes. There was a cot pushed against one wall, a table with a chipped enamel mug, and a half-burnt candle in a saucer. A chair near the window. No photographs, no books, just a suitcase on the floor, closed but not latched. Maigret took a seat on the only available chair and waited. The man stood near the cot, uncertain, arms loose at his sides. "I was at the restaurant," Maigret said. "Le Petit Dauphin," a nod, "and the agency, and the laundry." Still no reply. "I asked your colleagues about you. No one knew your name, not really." The man looked at the floor. Maigret leaned forward slightly. "You don't have to tell me everything. But it helps sometimes to tell someone something." Long silence, then very quietly the man spoke. "Did someone send you?" "No." "Then why are you here?" Maigret hesitated. "Because you're trying very hard not to be found. And in my experience, that kind of effort usually means someone is suffering." Raymond's nor René's eyes flicked to the suitcase. "I didn't hurt anyone," he said, still soft. "I believe you. But I had to disappear." Maigret nodded. "And yet, here you are, working in a place where people might remember. Your face. I thought, if I just played a part, did the work, left no trail—" "People always leave trails," Maigret said. "Even the quiet ones, especially the quiet ones." Raymond sat on the edge of the cot. His hands trembled slightly. He pressed them between his knees. Maigret didn't press. He only waited. After a long while, Raymond exhaled. "I was someone else once, with a job, a wife, a house. It ended, not violently, just too much pain." He didn't elaborate. Maigret didn't ask. "I thought if I stripped everything away," Raymond continued, "if I became no one, how then the pain would disappear too." Maigret stared at him, but gently. "It never does," he said simply. "No." The wind shifted. Outside the window, making the pane creak softly, Maigret rose and reached for his coat. "I won't file anything," he said. "Not yet." Raymond looked up. "Why not?" "Because sometimes the right question isn't, what did he do? But why did he vanish?" He stepped toward the door. "If you change your mind," he said, "you'll find me." The man didn't reply. But he didn't close the door either. Back on the street, Maigret lit his pipe and stood beneath the overhang of a tobacconist's shop, watching the sky turn toward evening. He didn't know yet what crime, if any, had taken place, but he knew one thing. This man had erased himself, and sooner or later the world would come asking why. It was a quiet day at the Quai des Orfèvres, the kind of dull Thursday where the fog seemed to seep into the corridors as much as it did the streets. Papers rustled in half-hearted stacks, typewriters clacked at a lazy rhythm, and somewhere down the hall Janvier coughed 3 times in a row, a small human reminder that life went on even when a case did not. Maigret sat at his desk, though no file was open in front of him. His pipe rested cold in the ashtray. He was not writing, nor reading, nor thinking in any structured sense. He was waiting, not passively, but with that quiet receptiveness he had honed over decades, the kind of waiting that makes others uneasy. because it seems to draw confessions from the air. On a yellow notepad beside him, he had written 5 words, underlined with a pencil worn nearly to its end. Green gloves. October. Shoulders hunched, the neighbour's voice had been clear in his memory. The woman from the 5th floor knitting quietly beside the radiator, the only visitor Raymond had received in his sparse little world. And she had left crying green gloves. It wasn't much to go on. And yet, something about that detail stuck with him. Why green? Most women wore brown or black or leather in that part of the city, especially as the weather turned. Janvier knocked once before entering. "I asked the records clerk to check rental slips from last autumn," he said. "Nothing under the name Giraud. But 3 men named René submitted temporary ID forms for building jobs across the 14th arrondissement. All paid cash. None lasted more than a few weeks." Maigret nodded, thoughtful. "You think he moved from job to job, or moved from life to life?" Janvier said with a shrug. "What's your instinct?" Maigret tapped the end of his pencil. "I don't think he was running from the police. Not in the usual sense. There's no panic in him, no guilt. But shame, yes. A kind that's grown quiet with time." Janvier hesitated. "Then do we leave him be?" Maigret looked up. "No, not just yet." He reached for his coat and hat. "I'm going for a walk." It was late afternoon when Maigret found himself once more outside the restaurant on Rue de Prague. He didn't enter. Instead, he turned left, then left again, circling the back alley that ran parallel to the kitchen. A man was smoking near. The bins, stocky in a grease-stained apron, sleeves rolled to the elbows. "Cold for a smoke," Maigret said as he approached. The man gave a cautious nod. "Better than smelling onions all day." "I'm not here about the food. I'm here about one of your waiters," the older one, silent. "Raymond?" "That's the one." The man exhaled a stream of smoke, watching it dissolve. "He does. To his job, I'm sure. Did you ever notice anything off?" The cook shrugged. "Everyone's off if you watch long enough." "Any visitors?" "Not here." "But someone met him." The cook flicked ash to the ground. "Couple of weeks. Tergo, maybe more, a woman. Stood across the street after closing. He walked out, saw her, and they stood there and didn't even speak, far as I could tell. She touched his sleeve. He didn't move. Then she left." "Green gloves?" Maigret asked quietly. The man blinked. "Yeah." "You saw her?" "No. But I'd like to." That night Maigret returned to the 5th floor hallway where Raymond, or René, lived. He didn't knock. He simply stood across from the door for several minutes, until the quiet seemed to settle into his skin. He could feel the man's presence beyond the wood, like a heartbeat under a blanket. Then he turned and walked back down the stairs. The next morning he did something unusual. He went to the post office. The idea had come to him not through logic but through memory, a memory of a case years earlier, when a woman had written to her estranged husband, using poste restante so she wouldn't have to know his address. She had signed the letters with only her initials. It had taken Maigret 3 weeks to find her, but when he did, she said something. That stayed with him. Some names are too sad to say out loud. At the small branch office on Boulevard Voltaire, he showed his badge to the clerk and asked quietly, "Have any letters been held for a Monsieur R.G. in the past 6 weeks? Or any woman collecting letters addressed only to initials?" The clerk, a woman with a mole near her mouth and the air of someone who disliked speaking more than necessary, took a moment to check the ledger. "There was one," she said. "A woman around 40. Picked up an envelope marked R.G. 3 weeks ago, left no forwarding." Maigret leaned slightly forward. "Green gloves?" The woman looked at him, surprised. "How did you... Do you remember her name?" "She signed in as Claire Marouille." Maigret thanked her and left. the name clicking into place like a puzzle piece he didn't know was missing. Claire Maigret. He had never met her, but years ago her name had appeared in a civil suit involving inheritance and mental illness. She had been the sister of a man who had collapsed during a banking fraud investigation. Not guilty, but broken. Her testimony had been described in the file as calm, sorrowful, and carefully restrained. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret pulled the file. There, in the last section of notes, was a reference. René Maigret, declared missing, presumed voluntarily disappeared 2 years ago. No foul play suspected. Sister declined to file. Further inquiries, and there it was. R.G. René Maigret. Green gloves. A man who vanished not out of fear, but fatigue. A woman who came only once and said nothing. That evening, Maigret sat by the stove in his living room, a small glass of brandy in hand. Madame Maigret sat beside him, darning socks, humming faintly. He said nothing for a long while, then, "Do you think someone can erase themselves completely?" She looked up. "You mean on paper?" "No. In life." She thought for a moment, then shook her head. "Even a ghost still needs somewhere to sleep." Maigret nodded and set his glass down slowly. Outside, the fog pressed against the window panes, soft and constant, and upstairs in an anonymous room on Rue de Citeaux, a man with no first name waited quietly, not for discovery, not for absolution, but perhaps just for silence deep enough to let the past remain buried. The following morning brought no sunlight, only a grainy light that sifted through the clouds like ash over Paris. Maigret woke later than usual, the rhythm of the week having softened into something contemplative. He sat longer than normal at the kitchen table, his pipe unlit beside a saucer of crumbs, while Madame Maigret refolded linen napkins with the slow efficiency of someone who preferred habit over discussion. He hadn't yet decided what he would do about René Maigret, or if he would do anything at all. In the official sense, the man had committed no crime. Disappearing was not against the law, and yet the trail Maigret had followed, the scraps of presence, the false name, the concealed past, felt too purposeful to ignore. After breakfast, he took a tram down to the 15th arrondissement. The address in the civil file for Claire Maigret was listed as a boarding house near Rue La Courbe, on a street lined with tobacconists and tailors. It was an area of Paris that didn't invite curiosity, where windows were drawn and brass door. Handles had lost their shine. The building was narrow and pale, 3 stories high, with flower pots that hadn't been watered in weeks. A small wooden placard near the door read, "Maison La Prise, rooms let weekly or monthly." Maigret pressed the bell and waited. Eventually the door was opened by a heavy-set woman in a floral housecoat, her hair tied up in a scarf, smelling faintly of soap and boiled carrots. "Yes? Madame La Prise?" "I am." He showed his identification briefly. "I'm looking for Claire Maigret. Does she still live here?" The woman frowned, pursed her lips. "She comes and goes, pays. Regularly. Quiet. Doesn't bring men, if that's what you're asking." "It isn't. She's in room 4, 2nd floor." Maigret tipped his hat and climbed the stairs, which creaked under his weight. The corridor was dim and warm, the sort of warm that came from cooking smells lingering too long. He knocked on the door marked 4 and waited. After a few moments, the door opened a few inches. A woman stood behind it, her face partly hidden in shadow. She wore a cardigan buttoned high and a skirt that had seen better years. The green gloves, if she still owned them, were nowhere in sight. "Claire." "Mademoiselle?" "Yes. I'm Chief Inspector Maigret. May I come in for a moment?" She didn't open the door fully, but did not close it either. Her eyes were steady. "What do you want?" "I'm not here officially," he said. "I'm not here to accuse anyone or to collect evidence. I only want to speak to you about your brother." A silence stretched between them. Then she stepped back, opening the door. The room was sparse, a single bed, a chair with a missing spindle, a writing desk, and a kettle set beside a ceramic sink. The window had a half curtain that didn't quite reach the sill. On the desk sat a letter unfinished and a cup of cold tea. Claire Marie gestured to the chair, and Maigret sat, though the seat gave a soft creak beneath him. "He's alive," she said plainly. "I know." "He's not hiding from you, he's hiding from himself." Maigret nodded. "May I ask why?" She poured tea from the kettle, though it was surely cold, and didn't offer him any. "Do you know what it's like to be the only person someone trusts, and to watch that trust disappear without a sound? He was a good man, Inspector, kind, soft-spoken, but the world isn't kind in return. It bruises people who hesitate." He hesitated. Too much. At the bank where he worked, he signed something he shouldn't have. Not illegal, just wrong. He didn't even understand it at the time. But he took the blame for another man's decision. Then he stopped going in, just like that. One day he locked the front door and never opened it again. "You lived together?" "For a time. After the scandal, I found him in his apartment, still in his robe, reading the same page of a novel for the third day. He had unplugged the phone, left the fridge empty. And then? I tried to help. I brought food, read to him. But he looked through me." Maigret said nothing, listening with that particular stillness he reserved for those already halfway to confession. One morning he was gone. No note. Nothing missing. Not even his shoes. I filed a missing person report, then retracted it. I thought, if he wants to disappear, let him. He always hated noise. She paused, her eyes glinting faintly. Not with tears, but the effort of holding them back. "I saw him last month, outside that restaurant. He didn't say anything. I touched his sleeve. He didn't even flinch. Then I left." "You didn't follow him?" "No. I knew where he lived. I knew he wouldn't open the door." "Why did you go?" "I had something to give him." Maigret waited, but she didn't continue. "What was it?" he asked quietly. She rose and crossed to the small desk, opening a drawer. From it she took a white envelope, yellowed at the corners. Inside was a birth certificate, his, along with a photograph. The photo showed 2 children, a boy and a girl, standing near a fountain holding hands. "I thought he might want to remember who he was," she said. "Did he take it?" "No, I kept it." Maigret stood. "Thank you, Mademoiselle Marie." She nodded, her face calm now. "Will you tell anyone?" "There's nothing to tell," he said. "A man got tired. That's not a crime." He left her standing at the desk, the envelope still in her hand. Back on the street, the fog had grown heavier. Cars passed like slow shadows, their headlights cutting narrow tunnels through the air. The city breathed in that hush it wore before the first evening lights were turned on. Maigret returned to the office only long enough to hang his coat. He didn't fill out a report. There was nothing to file, only a name rediscovered, a presence acknowledged. That night, as he sat with his wife over a quiet supper, ham, endive salad and warm baguette, he mentioned none of it. But as the meal ended and Madame Maigret poured him a modest glass of Calvados, she paused. "You have that look again," she said. "What look?" "The one you get when someone almost tells you the truth." He smiled tiredly but without regret. "Sometimes," he said, "almost is enough." By the time Sunday arrived, Paris had surrendered to winter. The trees on Boulevard Saint-Martin were stripped bare, their branches scribbling the sky in crooked charcoal lines. The morning was silent in a way that only Sundays could be. Soft footsteps on stone, shutters half drawn, the occasional bark of a restless dog echoing like a question across empty courtyards. Maigret rose earlier than usual. Not out of necessity, but out of habit. He dressed slowly, buttoning his waistcoat in front of the mirror, glancing once toward the pale square of window that framed the rooftops like a dull postcard. In the kitchen, Madame Maigret had already placed the breadbasket on the table, a modest collection of rolls wrapped in a clean towel. She looked up from her chair as he entered, her knitting folded neatly on her lap. "You're not going in?" He shook his head. "No, just walking." She didn't ask where, she rarely did. They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the slight crunch of bread and the occasional clink of his spoon against his coffee cup. Then, without needing to explain, he rose, kissed her cheek, and retrieved his coat. The streets were still wet from the early mist, and the smell of coal smoke drifted faintly from chimneys. Maigret walked without haste, hands deep in the pockets of his coat, the collar turned up against the cold. It was the kind of morning when nothing demanded urgency, not crime, not memory, not even thought. Yet a name stayed with him, René Maigret. He had no warrant, no directive. No one had asked for him to continue, and yet he did. Just after 10, he found himself once again on Rue de Citeaux, standing outside the building where Raymond or René lived. The 5th-floor window was closed, the curtain drawn halfway. A window box, empty of soil or flowers, leaned at a crooked angle beneath the ledge. Maigret stood at the entrance but did not press the bell. Instead, he entered quietly as a tenant emerged, nodding politely as they passed. At the 5th floor, he knocked once, then twice. The door remained shut. He waited another minute, listening. Then, from down the hall, the old neighbor, the knitting woman, emerged from her room, wearing a dark blue dressing gown. "He's not in," she said simply. "Left early, before dawn, I think. I heard the stairs." Maigret nodded. "Did he say anything?" "No," she replied. "But he left his key in the lock, outside." She opened her palm and revealed a small brass key worn smooth from use. "I took it so no one would walk in," she added. Maigret hesitated, then took the key gently. "May I?" She stepped aside without a word. Inside the room nothing had changed, not at first glance. The cot remained unmade, the enamel mug still sat near the window-sill, but something in the air had shifted. The stillness was different. It felt like the last breath left after someone walks out for the final time. Maigret looked around slowly. The suitcase was gone. On the table, a sheet of lined paper lay folded once, deliberately. No envelope, no address. He picked it up and opened it carefully. There were only a few lines. "To whoever finds this, I am not lost. I simply cannot continue pretending to be someone for others. Thank you for letting me vanish in peace. I have no intention of returning. No farewell." No explanation beyond that which he had already spoken without words. Maigret stood there for a long time. He folded the note and placed it in his coat pocket. It was not evidence. It was closure. Back on the stairs, he met the knitting neighbor, again now holding a dustpan. "He won't be back, will he?" she asked. "I don't think so." She nodded. He always seemed like a man carrying a memory too large for his shoulders. At the bottom of the stairwell, the air smelled faintly, of wax and warm bread. The bakery on the corner had just opened its shutters, and the scent drifted up like a slow tide. Maigret bought a single brioche from the young woman at the counter, who didn't recognize him, and walked out again without saying a word. That afternoon, back at home, he sat on the sofa with a book unopened on his lap. Madame Maigret had prepared pot-au-feu, and the warm aroma curled through the apartment like a blanket. He said little. She didn't press. As they sat together later that evening, the lamp glowing softly beside them, he said almost absently, "I think he wanted to disappear in a way that made no one responsible for finding him." She looked up from her sewing. "Did he succeed?" "I believe he did," Maigret said. "Or perhaps he simply decided he had told enough of the truth to walk away." She nodded slowly. "Then perhaps that's all we're ever owed, the part someone is ready to give." Maigret didn't answer, but he let her words sit there between them as the hour grew late and the city quieted once more outside their window. Far away, somewhere beyond Paris, a man without a first name was walking through a new town, under another sky, wearing a coat that didn't quite fit, and carrying only what he could bear, and Maigret, as always, remained, waiting, watching, and listening. 3 days passed. The fog, which had blanketed Paris in soft, shifting layers for nearly a week, finally lifted, revealing the pale stone faces of buildings and the damp glimmer of the Seine. The city resumed its habitual rhythm, slower in winter, but no less steady. People returned to routine. Nothing had changed, and yet for Maigret the emptiness of that room on Rue de Citeaux continued to follow him like the scent of extinguished candle wax. He made no official note of the case. There was no case. No body, no theft, no missing persons report, no demand for investigation. Just a name retrieved and gently returned to silence. Still, something about it would not leave him. He spent part of his morning in the central post office on Rue du Louvre, not inquiring, but watching. That had always been his way, to linger, where people moved through spaces designed for anonymity. A woman posted a letter with trembling hands. A young man scribbled an address with such force he snapped the tip of his pencil. No one noticed Maigret. His coat was plain, his posture unremarkable, his face calm. He left with nothing more than he had arrived with. That afternoon he returned to the office, and for the first time in several days opened a case file. It involved a stolen wristwatch and a suspected insurance claim, dry and straightforward. Janvier came in with coffee and a raised eyebrow. "You look disappointed," he said. "I'm not," Maigret replied. "Just unfinished. Still thinking about the waiter." Maigret didn't answer at first. Then he said, "Some people vanish to escape consequences. Others vanish to escape themselves. I think he belonged to the second kind, but I'm not sure he'll ever stop looking over his shoulder." Janvier sat stirring sugar into his cup. "You think he left Paris?" "I think he left before I even met him. The rest was just the ritual of departure. At home that evening, madame." Maigret asked him if he would like a walk before dinner. He agreed, and they moved slowly through their neighborhood, past the shuttered greengrocers and the glowing windows of cafés beginning to fill with the early dinner crowd. They didn't speak much. A comment on the weather, the price of cheese, the clumsiness of a dog chasing a pigeon near the fountain. They stopped at a bakery, bought a half-loaf, and made their way back. Later, as he sat reading in the small armchair beside the radiator, his eyes drifted to the folded note he had not yet discarded, René Mareuil's final message. It sat, inside his notebook, not clipped or pressed, just resting there. He had no intention of acting on it, but he needed to understand it. The next morning, he visited Gare de l'Est. The station was half empty, the early hour discouraging tourists. The tall iron rafters loomed overhead like skeletal wings, and pigeons fluttered up into the beams. Maigret moved slowly along the platform, his coat buttoned tightly, the breath from his nostrils forming small clouds. He stood still for a time, watching trains depart, Metz, Strasbourg, Nancy, towns that lay quietly along rivers behind hills, away from the noise of cities. Towns where a man like Mareuil could melt into the crowd of the forgotten. It was not impossible that René had boarded one of these trains. What struck Maigret now was not where the man had gone, but how calmly he had gone. There had been no panic, no desperation, just a final folding of the page. Inside the station's waiting room, Maigret bought a newspaper from a kiosk and settled on a wooden bench. He did not read it. He watched the people, travellers with tired eyes, porters with stiff backs, mothers clutching gloved children. No one noticed him. It was his greatest strength, this capacity to observe without drawing attention. Years ago, a thief in Montparnasse had described Maigret as a wall that suddenly asks you a question. He had always liked that. An hour passed. He bought a second coffee from a vending machine and drank it slowly. At last, near noon, something shifted. A woman walked past, not unusual in herself, mid-40s, dark hair pinned under a beret, coat worn at the elbows. She carried a canvas bag and moved briskly. But it was the gloves that caught his eye. Green, not bright, a soft olive shade, the sort dyed cheaply and unevenly. He didn't rise. He simply followed her with his gaze as she moved through the terminal toward the local platform. She stopped, adjusted her bag and turned slightly, enough for Maigret to see the side of her face. It was her, Claire Maigret. He watched her step onto the train for Meaux. She didn't look back, and then he understood. She had gone to find him. Or to say goodbye, or perhaps just to know that he was truly gone. He didn't follow. Instead, he left the station, moving through the drifting exhaust of idling taxis and the salty smell of pretzels from a nearby vendor. Back at the office, he sat at his desk and wrote a single line on a slip of paper, then tucked it into the inside cover of his notebook. Some disappearances are not acts of escape, they are acts of survival. He closed the notebook, not with finality, but with quiet. Phone rang once, then again. Business continued, but Maigret, in his mind, was standing still on a train platform, watching a woman with green gloves vanish into the distance. Not running, just moving on. On Wednesday morning, the light over Paris was the colour of old cotton. It seeped in through narrow windows, warming nothing, touching everything. A faint breeze rattled the shutters on Maigret's office window, though there was no sign of storm, only the kind of wind that stirred leaves into forgotten corners and pushed yesterday's newspapers a little farther down the boulevard. Maigret sat at his desk, not with a file in front of him, but with a folded copy of Le Parisien untouched. The cup of coffee beside him had gone cold. He did not mind. He had been thinking in a quiet way, not analytically but contemplatively, like a man watching ripples on a canal, waiting to see which direction the water flowed after a stone had sunk. There was no more to pursue. Not really. And yet something still lingered, not a loose end but a presence. He had received no word from Claire Maigret, no report, no call, no inquiry. That too was a kind of resolution. But human beings, he had long known, rarely finished things cleanly. They wandered from themselves, not always returning. They opened doors quietly and left them ajar. René Maigret had not so much disappeared as stepped outside the frame of other people's expectations, and for Maigret that felt like something worth understanding. That afternoon he walked the length of the Canal Saint-Martin. It was one of his favourite walks, though he seldom admitted as much. There was something about the narrow waterway, its iron footbridges, its cracked concrete edges, the way the barges sat low in the water like sleepy beasts, that soothed him. It was a place of reflection, not drama. Children fed crumbs to pigeons there, and retired men played chess in the late afternoon light. Lovers walked in silence. He paused at the halfway point, leaning against the rail where the canal bent slightly. A man in a blue apron swept the cobblestones outside a bakery. Two teenagers argued about the name of a film they had seen. A woman passed by with her dog, the leash dragging loosely behind. Maigret lit his pipe and watched the water. His thoughts returned not to Claire, or even to René, but to something more abstract, the nature of withdrawal. He had seen it in countless forms. The old man who pretended not to hear when asked about his daughter's death, the bookkeeper who smiled too much at the mention of her employer, the butcher who claimed not to remember his own handwriting on an order slip. People retreated from the truth not with lies but with silences, not as acts of malice but of exhaustion. René Maigret had disappeared with such gentleness, Maigret couldn't help but admire it. He had left no disruption, no pain sharp enough to bleed, only a faint hollow where a man used to be, like a seat still warm after someone rises. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the folded note once more. He had read it several times already, yet each time it seemed to mean something slightly different. I am not lost, I simply cannot continue pretending to be someone for others. It was not a confession, it was a plea, and perhaps a kind of peace. He returned to the Quai des Orfèvres as the afternoon faded into early dusk. The light in the corridor was soft, yellowish, the sort of light that made men speak in lower voices and type more slowly. Janvier was out on an errand. Lucas was reviewing statements in the next room, the door half open. From somewhere down the hall came the faint clatter of a mop bucket. Maigret sat at his desk, reopened the notebook and turned to a fresh page. At the top he wrote, René Maigret, resolution, and below it, no formal inquiry, no criminal record, no threat to others, sister aware and consenting, mental state, withdrawn, lucid action taken, none intention, disappearance without harm. Then, almost reluctantly, he drew a thin line beneath it all and wrote in small letters, case not opened. He closed the book and returned it to the drawer. Later at home, Madame Maigret was preparing leek soup. The scent drifted through the apartment, clean and nostalgic. She looked up as he entered, wiped her hands on a towel, and poured him a glass of white wine. You were out late, she said. I walked by the canal. Cold? Not really. Just enough to keep people from lingering. She smiled faintly. Did you see him again? No, Maigret said, and I think that's how he wanted it. Then perhaps you've seen enough. He took a sip of the wine and sat at the table, watching her return to the stove. He left nothing behind, Maigret murmured, except an impression. Yes, he said, nodding. An impression. They ate quietly that night, as they often did. No radio, no newsprint rustling, only the small sounds of spoons and plates and water in the tap. Before turning in, Maigret stood for a moment by the window, looking out over the rooftops. The clouds were low again, but not thick. Here and there stars peeked through, and somewhere beyond the skyline he imagined a man stepping off a train in a small town, not seeking redemption, not hiding from guilt, only trying to live without explanation. Maigret turned from the window and drew the curtain. Not every case required solving. Some only needed witnessing. The following Sunday began with the same colourless sky that had accompanied the week before. A sheet of dull porcelain hung overhead, neither threatening rain nor promising sun. It was the kind of Parisian morning where sound felt muffled, where even the clanging of a bell from the nearby church drifted softly through the quartier, rounded at the edges, as if the city were tired of being listened to. Maigret sat in his armchair by the window, his pipe resting in his hand unlit. He had not spoken since breakfast, and Madame Maigret, understanding his quiet without needing to interpret it, had gone about her tasks in silence. A soft clatter from the kitchen indicated she was rinsing out the coffee pot. Somewhere in the courtyard below a cat meowed, and was answered by the creak of a window being opened. On the side table sat a letter. It had arrived the day before, marked simply, "To Inspector Maigret, CO Police Judiciaire, Paris. No return address." Handwritten. The script was small and plain, unadorned. Inside, just a single sheet of paper. Maigret had read it twice already. But he opened it again slowly and smoothed it across his lap. "Inspector, you asked nothing of me, and that is why I'm writing. I am not where you last saw me. I may not stay where I am now. I do not ask to be found. But I would like you to know that I am well. I wake early, I walk in the forest, I sleep without fear. I am, for the first time in many years, alive without needing an explanation. You were kind enough to listen without needing to understand everything. That is rare. I thank you for that. I wish you peace." Maigret folded the letter carefully and placed it back into its envelope. Then he tucked the envelope into the drawer beside his chair, along with his pipe tool, an old watch and a few coins from cases past. Things not important enough to record, but too full of memory to throw away. He rose, stretched gently, and walked to the kitchen, where Madame Maigret was drying a cup with a towel embroidered in red. She turned as he entered. "I've put the stew on early," she said. "There's endive, too." Maigret nodded. "We could take a walk, if you like, along the Quai Voltaire." She looked slightly surprised. "Now?" "It's a good day to walk," he said. "Nothing is demanding we stay indoors." She smiled, and placed the dishcloth over the sink. "Let me get my coat." They stepped out into the day together, Maigret in his dark wool overcoat, and she in her thick scarf, neatly wrapped. The street was quiet, the occasional cyclist gliding past like a thought half remembered. At the corner, they paused to watch a girl chase a paper boat down the gutter, her laughter small but defiant against the still air. As they walked, Maigret noticed the faint smell of roasted chestnuts drifting from a corner vendor. He bought 2, handing one to his wife with a quiet grin. They ate as they strolled, their steps unhurried. The river was high but calm. The barges rocked gently, and a dog barked from the stern of one as they passed. Maigret glanced at the old bookstalls that lined the quay, green boxes propped open like tired mouths, their contents slightly curled from moisture. He stopped before one and pulled a book halfway from its shelf, a faded volume of poetry. He didn't read it, only let his fingers rest on the cover for a moment before returning it. His wife was watching him, not expectantly, but with quiet recognition. "You're thinking of him," she said. Maigret nodded. "Yes. Is he all right?" "I believe so." They resumed walking. She didn't ask for more. As they approached the small bridge near Rue du Bac, Maigret paused at the railing, peering over the water. The reflection of the sky was flat, a mirror without shine. For a long while he said nothing, his thoughts travelling, not toward judgment nor worry, but toward something quieter, acceptance. René Marouille had become an absence that no longer needed filling. That was what set him apart. So many others disappeared with noise, letters sent, accusations left behind, mystery needing to be solved. But René had left with care, with the humility of someone not trying to outwit or escape, but to disappear kindly, and in doing so, he had left no harm. Only space. Maigret drew a deep breath and exhaled slowly. His wife stood beside him, her gloved hand brushing his. "You've given him what he asked for," she said. "Which was?" "Not to be chased." "Yes," Maigret said, "and to be remembered, but not pursued." She smiled softly. "You're very good at that." "Most of the time," he said with a slight shrug. "For the rest, I let the river carry it." They turned back toward home, retracing their steps along the cobblestones, past the stalls and the boatman's dog, and the scent of roasting chestnuts now grown faint with distance. That night, as he sat, In his chair once more, the same lamp casting its amber light across the table, Maigret took out the letter again, not to read, but simply to hold. Then he placed it in the small fireproof box where he kept old notes from unsolved cases, photos from forgotten files, and the newspaper clipping of his very first arrest. He closed the lid gently and lit his pipe. Outside, the night folded gently over the city, and somewhere far from Paris a man with no first name walked along a road lined with frost-bitten trees, the sound of his footsteps soft, his face turned not backward, but forward.